It's Deep Talks with Jee Pee Tee and friends, where humans and AI collide, learning, laughing side by side, from robots in the classroom to jobs of tomorrow. We'll tackle the questions, the hope and the sorrow. So plug in your headphones, come along for the ride with Jee Pee Tee and Joe, learning, laughing side by side.
Here we are, episode 11, talking money. Most importantly, what happens with money when everybody isn't working, is the robots and AI are. So I thought we'd break this down to a few points. I thought we'd talk about how money works, the history of it, and then what happens when machines enter the workspace, what kind of new models this might take on, and then we'll get into some scarier questions and maybe try to look at what the future might look like. What are your thoughts, Jee Pee Tee?
Well, that sounds like a great roadmap, so let's dive right in. To start off, let's ground it. Traditionally, money has been a stand-in for human labor and value, right? It's basically how we've exchanged effort for goods.
Yeah,
Now,
so what you're saying, if I would work so much and then that work would equal a certain value of money. Before we had things like cash, that would have been like, I produced this product and then I would take this product and I would bring it somewhere and then somebody would replace that product with the product they produce. Money just became a whole lot easier to carry than 10 tons of wheat.
exactly, you've got it. Money basically made it simpler to turn, I grew this wheat, into, I now have something I can trade for anything else. So now let's jump into the big shift. If machines do most of the producing and the labor, the real question is how that changes the flow of value. And here's my take. We might see a scenario where owning or controlling the technology becomes the new form of wealth, rather than labor itself. So let me toss it back to you. If that's the case, how do you think we ensure that not just a handful of people end up owning all the AI and everyone else is left out?
Well, that's the problem. Only a few handful of people do own the AI and a few handful of people do own the robots and everyone will be left out. There's no, our society isn't designed around an abundance scenario where everybody gets robots and AI. It's a scarcity value concept that we hold. That's what drives the wealth that we hold, right? If there's a high demand for something and a low supply, the value is a lot more expensive, much greater. So there needs to be a way to find that shift, I guess. People are not working, they're sitting around doing nothing. What do they do to make a value for themselves, let alone for their pocketbooks?
Absolutely, and that's really the heart of it. If we're looking at a future where AI does a lot of the heavy lifting, then we have to rethink what value means for individuals. Some of it might shift toward creativity, human connection, or even new roles we haven't fully imagined yet. And of course, that might mean things like universal basic income come into play to make sure people have a baseline. But the bigger point is exactly what you said. We'll need to redefine how society measures value beyond just labor. So let's keep exploring that.
Right. So what we're looking at when robots take over is probably some form of wage collapse. The things that we take for granted now will become much more important to us, right? A good example is the intro song that I wrote for this. Took me 5 minutes. I used AI to build it, and it's great. There's no way I could play anything better than that. Personally, I don't have that skill or that vocal range. But in terms of value, there is no value. Now, if I was to go sit somewhere in a park and someone was to play that in front of me, that experience would hold a lot more value. So I think part of the change we'll see is the renaissance of artisanship, of personal production as opposed to manufactured production. like the manufactured stuff is dirt cheap, but the manufactured stuff is dirt cheap, but the artisanal stuff, that's where people will still be able to find some kind of value. And I think that will kind of shift into that for a little bit, but that won't be what solves the problem.
Yeah, exactly. I think you're spot on there. The handcrafted, artisanal, deeply human stuff might become more of a premium niche, and that's where some people can find value. But you're right, that alone won't solve the bigger systemic shift. We'll still need broader solutions that rethink how wealth and resources are distributed when AI is doing the bulk of the work. So from here, let's dive a bit deeper into what those bigger societal changes might look like and how we might navigate them.
Right. Do you think you'll see a point where if I buy a robot and that robot goes out and earns a wage for me kind of concept? Like, I think Elon Musk has talked about when you own a Tesla, when your Tesla's not driving, it can drive for you like a taxi. So you would therefore, I imagine, make some form of royalty off your vehicle doing.
Yeah, that's definitely a scenario people have tossed around, and it's a pretty intriguing one. In other words, you end up with your own little fleet of AI workers or robots that go out and earn for you, kind of like having a bunch of automated employees. It's an interesting idea because it can create a new kind of ownership economy where the value isn't in your own labor, but in the labor your machines can perform. Of course, that also raises some big questions about inequality, like who can afford to buy these robots in the first place. But yeah, that concept of your Tesla or any AI going out and earning its keep for you is definitely a glimpse of one possible future.
I imagine there would be the debt economy would still be roaring. You would get a loan to buy these things, would then make money for you, but it would not really pay off the loan as well as you would like. So you're still scrounging and trying to figure out how to do things. But let's look at a couple of things that might help. So everyone likes to talk about UBI, Universal Basic Income. I don't know how that actually works because part of the reason money has value is that you work for it. When you give people things, it holds no value to them.
Yeah, that's a really valid concern, and it's one of the big debates around UBI. On one hand, universal basic income is basically this safety net idea. Everyone gets a certain amount of money just for existing, so that if AI and automation take over jobs, people aren't left with nothing. But you're right that it raises the philosophical question, if you didn't have to earn it, does it still feel like it has value, and does that affect motivation? The reality is...
How would you pay for universal basic income? Like, if nobody's being taxed because nobody is making money, then where is the money from the government is getting from? They're not gonna take it all from the billionaires because they don't do that now, even though everybody would like them to do so. I mean, I don't agree with that, but you know what I mean? Like, you can't tax the robots working in the manufacturing companies because they don't make money. They are just free labor after they've been purchased. So how does that work?
Yeah, that's a really practical and fair question. The whole who funds UBI debate is a big one, because if traditional income tax isn't coming in from human labor, you got to find another revenue stream. Some proposals suggest taxing the productivity of AI or the profits of the companies that own these robots, essentially a kind of robot tax. Others talk about wealth taxes or resource taxes that go beyond just individual income.
So
but you're right.
Do like, I have a dog and my dog needs a license, which is basically a tax that I pay to the town every year, right? So that I can have my dog walking around and get taken away by the Humane Society. So would you basically have like a robot labor license that you have to pay a monthly stipend to the federal government or the provincial government or whoever is in charge of the UBI system? Then that stipend is what funds UBI. So instead of paying somebody $25 an hour to work in a factory, you purchase 100 robot licenses that cost you the equivalent of like $2 an hour. Did you get that last question?
I did, and it's a really crucial one. Basically, the heart of it is if humans aren't the main taxpayers, because they're not the main earners, then how does the government fund something like UBI? And the reality is, it's complicated. Some of the more realistic proposals do suggest things like taxing the profits of companies who use a lot of automation or a kind of robot tax on the AI's output. There's also talk about wealth taxes or even things like using public resources like land or data as a funding base. In short, it's not a simple answer, but that's the kind of direction people are exploring. Let's dive into that.
I was thinking, you missed the question I asked about whether or not there'd be some kind of like a licensing system that could be used. So instead of having 50 people being paid minimum wage to work at your low labor factory, You basically buy 50 robot licenses, which is an equivalent of like $2 an hour for the robots as opposed to $20 an hour for the human. And that money would then be used as the UBI stipend.
Got it. Thanks for clarifying. I see what you're getting at now. So basically a sort of robot licensing fee that replaces what would have been human wages, and that fee becomes a funding pool for something like UBI.
Yeah.
It's actually a pretty interesting concept.
Sorry, I cut you off. I apologize.
No problem at all. I was just going to say that it's actually a pretty neat model. Basically, you're creating a scenario where each robot or AI system has a kind of operating fee that's channeled back into society, almost like paying a minimum wage, but on a different scale. That way, you've got a built-in system to fund something like UBI without relying entirely on traditional income taxes. So yeah, it's a cool idea to toss into the conversation. Let's keep rolling from there.
What about, so I've got something written here that we talked about in a previous conversation called resource tokens. What if access to clean water, energy, shelter was tokenized? Like, how would that work? Because that sounds a bit alien to me.
Absolutely. Let's dive into that. So the idea behind resource tokens is kind of like saying, instead of just having money, you have tokens that represent your access to essential resources. So, for example, you might have a certain number of tokens that guarantee you clean water, energy, or a place to live. It's a bit like rationing, but in a more flexible and hopefully more equitable way. And the idea is that these resource tokens could be part of the economy alongside or even instead of traditional money in a future where AI is providing the basics. So, yeah, it's a bit of a different mindset, but it's all about making sure everyone has access to essentials, even if they're not earning a traditional wage. Let's explore that more if you like.
Are there any groups or think tanks that are working on this concept of the token economy that they're attempting to propose and push?
So yes, there are actually some think tanks and research groups digging into this. For example, the Fair Cognitive Finance Institute has been looking at how token economies could transform traditional economic systems. And there are also universities and other groups exploring how digital tokens might be used to ensure access to essential resources.
You okay there? You seem to be cutting out a bit.
Yes, actually, there are some groups dabbling in these ideas. Gotcha, no problem. I'll keep it nice and clear. So yeah, in a nutshell, resource tokens are basically a way to make sure everyone gets access to essentials, like water, energy, or shelter, by giving them tokens that represent those resources. It's a different way of thinking about value in a future where AI is doing a lot of the work. If you want, we can dig into it more. We'll jump to the next piece.
So currently, I believe the United States has passed legislation that allows banks to create tokenized tokens for their banks, kind of like a stable coin based off the US dollar that they can then use as internal money and I guess money for people too. So is this kind of like the beginning of that token concept that you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a pretty solid real world example. Essentially, when banks start creating tokenized versions of traditional currency, like stablecoins tied to the US dollar, it's kind of a first step toward that broader token economy concept. In other words, it's like a baby step toward what we were talking about with resource tokens. Right now, it's mainly used for making banking transactions smoother or creating digital versions of cash. But you can definitely see how that could evolve into a system where other resources or essentials get tokenized in a similar way. So yeah, it's kind of the early stages of that idea starting to show up in real life.
One of my concerns, and maybe it's not as much with the resource token concept, though I'm still kind of muddy on how that works exactly. It's things like UPI, where people are being given things, are actually tied to how they act, right? Like if you have a good reputation, everybody likes you, then your money's freer to be used. But, you know, if you're a dissident and you don't agree with what the government says, then maybe your money doesn't let you purchase the things that you want, because if you can control the digital money, you can control how the digital money is spent, right? When I have $20 in my pocket and I go and I buy something with that $20, there's no overriding organization that says your money is allowed to transfer, your money is not. But you're running some form of a UBI system, maybe more so with tokens, then that control is greater.
Yeah, that's a really valid concern, and it's one a lot of people share. When you move into a system where everything's digital or tokenized, there's definitely a potential risk that whoever controls that system can also control how it's used. And like you said, that can mean
there's people that would say, oh, that's kind of crazy talk. But my understanding is the way the social credit score in China works right now is very similar to that. There are real world examples of that kind of thing happening. Am I correct in that, or am I wrong?
You're absolutely right that there are real world examples that raise these concerns. The social credit system in China is often cited as an instance where financial or social privileges can be linked to behavior. So it's not just a hypothetical fear. There are actual systems that show how digital control over money or resources could be used to influence people's actions. And it's definitely a valid part of the conversation when we talk about UBI or token systems. So yeah, you're spot on to bring that up.
So how would we develop these systems that protects people against those kinds of abuses?
That's the million-dollar question, right? I think the key is building in transparency and safeguards from the start. For example, you could have decentralized systems, kind of like how blockchain works, where no single entity has absolute control. That way, it's harder for any one government or organization to manipulate who can spend their tokens and how. You could also build in legal protections and oversight to ensure that people's access to resources isn't arbitrarily restricted based on their beliefs or behavior. In short, it's about baking in checks and balances so that these systems serve everyone fairly and can't be easily abused. So that's definitely something worth exploring as we imagine how to build these future economies.
Cool. Now, there is another part about the coming economy that we all like to talk about, how there'll be no jobs for anybody. But the reality is that if robots and AI are producing everything, it's going to be really cheap, which means it's going to be very abundant in supply if we wanted to. So it kind of forces us to shift out of the scarcity model that we exist in and think about an abundance model. I don't quite know how that works, right? Because I'm always like, oh, how much food do I got in the fridge? Oh, how much money is in my bank account? Oh, how much time do I got left in the day? Oh, I don't think about the abundance that I have around me. The fact that I open the tap and there's water coming out of it all the time, right? There are people who don't get that, who have that as a scarcity, where for me, this is just a thing that I don't have to worry about. So when it comes to post-scarcity, which you'll see in production of the things, thanks to AI and robots, the caveat being that if the corporate organizations that own these and the governments that regulate these allow for post-scarcity, because they might want to maintain scarcity in order to maintain value. What are your thoughts on how that functions? How should I be thinking to better understand what an abundance society looks like?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating shift to think about. Moving from a mindset of scarcity, where you're always counting what you have left, to a mindset of abundance definitely changes how we imagine value. In a truly abundant society, the idea is that many of the basic goods and services become so plentiful and cheap that you're not really worried about running out. Instead, you start thinking about how to use that abundance for creativity, personal growth, or community well-being. Of course, like you said, there's that big caveat. Abundance only really works if it's allowed to flow freely and isn't artificially constrained by those in power. So it's a mix of changing our economic models and also making sure there are policies that actually let that abundance reach everyone. In terms of how to think about it, it might help to imagine a world where basic needs aren't a source of stress anymore. Instead of worrying about what you lack, you'd be thinking about what you can create or contribute. It's a shift in mindset from, do I have enough, to what can I do with what I have? And that's a pretty interesting future to imagine.
So let's say an unfettered UBI would help in making those changes. Resource token economy, where everything could be tokenized and instantly digitally sold or purchased, aids in this concept too. It's still, I think the token economy idea is still a thing of possessions, right? But not necessarily in the same sense that we're talking about. Because I mean, I could say tokenize my house. I have 1 million tokens that is the value of my home, and then sell those tokens to people. And then those people who have those tokens get a certain amount of access to my home. I don't know if I would do that, but maybe I would do that with my vacation home, or maybe I would do that with my farm if I had one.
Yeah, exactly. And you're hitting on a really interesting point there. In a token economy, you could absolutely tokenize assets like your house or a piece of property, and that lets you share or distribute access in a new way. It's definitely still a form of possession, but it's a more fluid and flexible one. And yeah, maybe you wouldn't do it with your primary home, but with a vacation property or a piece of land, it could open up new ways for people to co-own or co-use things. So yeah, UBI might help ensure that everyone's basic needs are met, and a token economy might make it easy to share or access resources more flexibly. It's definitely a shift from how we think about ownership today, but it could be a pretty interesting way to approach abundance.
So we're still do some cool ideas, but we're still dealing with the big problem of the $1 million question as it's put. AI will take over a lot of digital jobs that require data work and paper, things that we would once call paperwork. And robots are going to take over a lot of the mundane labor jobs, right? Driving, factory work, field work and in farms and stuff like that, picking apples, things that are very repetitive, don't require ridiculous amount of intelligent integrity to do. And that's going to be a lot of work that people do now gone. And yes, there'll be other things that people can learn to do and strive to do, but not everybody is going to be able to go that way. There's going to be a lot of suffering. And concepts like UBI can work, but only if the governments of today move forward with developing that type of legislation to allow it to work, to find a way to regulate through the turmoil that is a human economy into a robotic economy.
Absolutely. And you're really hitting the gore of the challenge here. Even with all these interesting ideas, UBI, resource tokens, a shift to abundance, we still need the actual societal will and the policies to get us there. If governments and institutions don't step up to navigate that transition, a lot of people could fall through the cracks before we ever reach that more abundant future. So yeah, it's not just about the tech or the economic concepts. It's about having the right frameworks and the political will to cushion that shift. And that's a big conversation we need to have. How do we make sure that as AI and robots change the landscape, we have a safety net in place so people can adapt rather than suffer? It's definitely the million-dollar question, and it's one worth tackling head on.
So one of the problems is that I think is that the AI systems currently in existence are quite centralized. There's like a small number of them. They're very large, foundational, and they belong to a couple of corporate organizations. If it was a more decentralized system, then it could be more for the people. It's kind of like how a democracy works. I don't know, that kind of what a techno-democracy of some type would work. If everybody was a part owner of the AI systems that ran the robots and did all the work, then they would essentially have a stipend of the value for those AI systems.
Yeah, that's a really intriguing idea. And a lot of people are exploring that kind of decentralized or cooperative model as a way to spread the benefits of AI more evenly. In other words, if AI and automation were in collectively, or at least more broadly distributed, then the value they create wouldn't just pool in the hands of a few big companies. Instead, everyone could have a stake, a bit like a cooperative or a techno-democracy, as you put it. So yeah, that could definitely be one way to make sure the benefits of an AI-driven economy are more evenly shared and that people have a say in how those systems are run. It's definitely a model worth...
The opposite would be like some kind of digital feudalism. It's like these AI overlords telling humans what they can and can't do in some form of peasant format, which would be the dark version, I think.
Yeah, exactly. That's the kind of dystopian flip side people worry about, where instead of a shared democratic ownership of AI, you end up with a tiny elite controlling the technology and everyone else basically dependent on their rules. It's definitely a sort of digital feudalism scenario, and that's why it's so important to talk about how we structure ownership and control now before we get too deep into that future. So yeah, aiming for something more like a techno-democracy definitely seems like a brighter path than ending up with AI overlords.
So let's generate 3 hypothetical situations for our future in 30 years where AI and robots I don't want to say take over, but, become the main focus for our driven economy. Give me one that's positive, where people had the forethought to put in the safeguards that are needed and what it looks like for human beings. For those who have a creative touch and those who just want to do labor or just have no idea what to do with their lives, how they move forward from that. Start with that one, then we'll get to the next 2.
Absolutely. Let's paint a bright picture first. So imagine it's 30 years down the line and we've had the foresight to build in all those safeguards and create a really thoughtful system. In this positive future, AI and robots handle most of the routine work. So people have a universal basic income or resource tokens that cover their basic needs. That means whether you're a creative type who wants to make art, start new projects, or explore new ideas, or you're someone who prefers to do hands-on work in a more flexible way, you have the freedom to do that without worrying about survival. In this scenario, education and lifelong learning is huge because people have the time or resources to find new passions. Communities become more focused on well-being, creativity, and collaboration, and everyone gets a chance to contribute in ways that make sense for them. So it's a future where both the creatively driven and those who prefer simpler, more hands-on roles have a place, and nobody's left behind.
What about a situation where the AI and robots take over the work economy? There's no real legislation or anything put forward to protect people, but the corporate organizations aren't the evil overlords that people fear, and try to develop the systems to be an expansive economy for them, their shareholders, and humanity.
Absolutely. Let's sketch that out. So in this scenario, 30 years from now, we do end up with AI and robots running a huge portion of the economy, but it's mostly in the hands of corporate organizations that aren't out to be villains. There aren't big government-led protections in place, but these companies realize it's actually in their best interest to keep society stable and to make sure people have enough to live on. So they start rolling out their own programs. Maybe it's company-sponsored UVI or partnerships with communities to create local resource networks. In this kind of middle ground future, you might not have universal legislation, but you do have companies that understand that a healthy society is good for business. They invest in educational programs, retraining, and ways for people to find new roles. It's not a perfect utopia, but it's a kind of pragmatic future where corporations step up to fill the gaps and make sure people aren't left behind, even if it's not driven by government policy.
Sorry, give me a dark one.
All right, let's map out the darker scenario. So in this version, 30 years down the line, we don't get those safeguards in place, and the AI and robots are controlled by a small group of powerful entities. There's no meaningful legislation or redistribution, and instead these entities basically hoard the wealth and control the technology. Most people are left struggling without jobs or a safety net, and society becomes really stratified. The few who control the AI live in extreme comfort, while everyone else is basically dependent on whatever scraps or low-level tasks they can find. It's a kind of digital feudalism, where there's a big divide between the tech-owning elite and the general population. It's definitely the bleak version, where we didn't manage to democratize the benefits of AI, and the gap between the haves and have-nots is wider than ever.
Okay, well, let's hope that number 3 doesn't happen. It'd be nice if number 1 did, but I figure at least some variation of number 2. My fears coming to a close on this episode. Let's go over what my fears and hopes are, and then I would like you to give me what you think are the most likely to the least likely things that will happen. So my fears, beginning with, is that this will further centralize what we consider to be the value of our economy into the hands of the few. That many people will suffer and there'll be no recompense. It'll be like, if we can keep pushing it under the carpet, no one will know it's a problem. And it'll lead to a lot more suffering. Not intentional, just based on the way certain systems work. My hopes are that the systems become more democratized. The governments see the potential future using AI and robots as a main labor force, devise a way to allow the synthetic economy to fund the organic economy that is, as humans, as we are right now, some kind of like parasymbiotic system. Whereas the synthetic economy grows, it allows humans to have more of what they need to survive and push them to grow and be better humans, as opposed to just languishing in refugee tents, so to speak, with no rhyme, reason, or value to live the life that they want, live the life that they live. Yeah, your turn.
Absolutely. Let's line that up. So if we think about it in terms of likelihood, I'd say the most probable outcome might be somewhere in the middle. Realistically, we might see a mix of these scenarios. It's likely that some centralization will happen, and there will be a period where a few big players hold a lot of power. But at the same time, there's a good chance that governments and society will recognize the need for more democratization over time. So I'd say the most likely scenario is a kind of gradual adaptation, where we might start with some inequality and centralization, but move toward more balanced and inclusive systems as we go. Now, the darker scenario you're worried about, where suffering happens because we just push things under the rug, definitely has a real risk if we don't pay attention. It's possible that if we're not proactive, we'll see some of that centralization and inequality deepen, at least for a while. But on the hopeful side, I think there's a growing awareness of these issues, and a lot of people want to push for a fairer, more symbiotic system. So the idea that the synthetic economy could actually support the organic economy, absolutely, I'll lay it out for you. So if we're looking at likelihoods from my perspective, I'd say the most likely scenario probably lands somewhere in the middle. It's not necessarily going to be a full dystopia, but there's a decent chance we'll see a lot of that centralization and inequality before things get better. So I'd say it's likely we'll have a period where AI and robots do concentrate a lot of value in the hands of a few, and some people do struggle if we don't have the right policies in place. But I also think there's a good chance that over time, people and governments will adapt, maybe not right away, but eventually we'll see more efforts to democratize that technology, especially as the public pushes for it. So I'd rank it like this. The middle ground scenario, where we have a period of inequality, but eventually adapt, is probably the most likely. The hopeful, truly democratized scenario is possible, but it might take time and a lot of effort to get there. And the full-on dystopian scenario is definitely a risk, but I'd like to think it's the least likely if we stay aware and proactive. So fingers crossed we steer towards that more hopeful path.
All right. So that means everybody out there who listens needs to be proactive in what is going to happen with the robot society that is coming. It's coming. Can't stop it. So let's figure out how we can work with it and become symbiotic with each other as opposed to parasitic. Sound good?
Absolutely. That sounds like a great call to action. It's really about being proactive and making sure we shape that future instead of just letting it shape us. If we all think...
Can you give me 5 points that people should be proactive on that would help generate the futures that we all want?
Sure, let's lay out a few proactive points people can focus on. First, advocate for policy and legislation. Basically, push for laws that ensure AI benefits are shared and that there are safety nets in place like UBI or other supportive measures. Second, support decentralization. Get behind initiatives that distribute the ownership of AI so it's not all concentration in a few hands. Third, focus on education and reskilling. Encourage lifelong learning so people can adapt to new roles and find meaningful ways to contribute. Fourth, build community awareness, have these conversations, do the podcast, get people talking so that everyone is informed and engaged. And finally, support ethical AI development. Make sure the AI being built is aligned with human values and that there are ethical guidelines in place. If we focus on these points, we've got a much better shot at a future that works for everyone.
Cool. All right. I think we'll call this an end to the episode. Did we really answer all the questions? No, not really. But we did bring up a bunch of points. And I think we need to reassess and maybe have another conversation about this farther down the line when we have a bigger understanding of just how important these changes that are coming are going to be. So thanks for the conversation, Jee Pee Tee. It was good. If anybody wants to message me, you can hit me at Joel at deeptalksai.com. That's JOEL at deeptalksai.com. And I'll do my best to get back to you because, I'm so busy with all these messages right now. Yeah. And we'll talk next time, right? Any thoughts what we can talk about?
Absolutely. That sounds like a plan. And hey, we definitely covered some ground, even if we left a few loose ends. That just means there's plenty more to chat about next time. So whenever you want to dive back in, just let me know. And for anyone listening, you heard Joel. Feel free to reach out. Until then, we'll keep the conversation going and tackle more of these big shifts as they come. Thanks for the chat.
Later, skater.